Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining this event. My name is Karim El-Gandhi, and I'm an associate fellow here at Chatham House, where I focus on cities and climate policy. It is my pleasure to chair this session on cities as leaders in climate action. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation, which I hope to be a wonderful insight into the role of cities. So cities are an incredibly important piece of our climate action puzzle. In an urban and urbanizing world, cities are both the major cause of climate change and the places that needs to be adapted most to its impacts. They represent less than 3% of global land use, but their ecological footprint spans the globe. As the most efficient form of human settlement, cities have become the locus and the center of gravity of the global economy. They promise many economic benefits, from agglomeration and economies of scale to the networking effect. But these economic structures that we call cities have created complex urban environments with spaces, assets, and complex networked flows running through them. And despite their economic benefits, cities and their footprints have become the cause of many social and environmental injustices. So all attempts to localize climate action in cities have invariably come up against these challenges and many more. And the notions of climate mitigation and adaptation have given way to more localized terms, such as urban sustainability and urban resilience. They did that in order to better reflect the interconnected nature of cities, of their urban systems, and the agendas that are at play in these arenas. And so cities, despite all of this, have surprisingly surpassed all expectations, and have in many cases demonstrated commitments to climate action that surpass the local, their national governments in which they are in. These governments are the actual signatories to the UNFCCC, to the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. So surpassing them was certainly a surprise to all of us. So what is the state of climate action in cities, and what challenges does it face, and what is the road ahead? And this is why we're holding this event today. And to talk about this, we have two wonderful guests. We have Mark Watts, who's the Executive Director of C40, and we have Shirley Rodriguez, who's the Deputy Mayor for Energy and Environment, the London Authority. We also previously had scheduled Imani Kumar, who's the Deputy Director at ICLEI, who could not join us, unfortunately, due to a family bereavement. We'll share the biographies of all speakers in the chat. But before we start, just a few notes. This event is a part of the Environment and Society discussion series, which aims to promote knowledge sharing and policy dialogue to mitigate and adapt to impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, and natural resource depletion. The Environment and Society program is a research program here at Chatham House, the one that I personally belong to, focusing on the environmental risks of certain societies and strategies to mitigate and adapt and build resilience to these risks. The event was also brought to you by Chatham House's Sustainability Accelerator, which researches ideas, researches, assembles and incubates ideas that can help the world accelerate towards a more sustainable future with a specific focus on innovation and finance. In terms of the order of our talk today, we'll start with Mark's remarks first, before turning to Shirley Rodriguez, who will then we will then have a roundtable discussion after that, and there will be definitely an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So please send your questions via the question and answer facility, addressing them to one speaker or two speakers as you like, and we will compile these and direct them to our esteemed panelists after their remarks. So with that, I think I'll turn to Mark, and please, Mark, if you could briefly explain to us in your words, why do you think cities matter as a unit of climate action? What actually makes them different than national governments? And what role do coalition organizations like yours, like C40 or others, can play in accelerating change towards better climate action? And what success have we seen during COP26? So Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Karim, and hello, everybody. Well, I think on that first part of your question, the why do cities matter? You at the moment got to take it in the context of COP26, which is still fresh in our minds. I'd say cities matter more than ever in terms of the struggle to overcome climate breakdown, because COP26 confirmed that we can't wait for intergovernmental negotiation to solve the climate crisis. It's the 26th of the meetings between the parties, the nation states on climate, and still not setting targets even consistent with genuinely science-based climate action. There was progress. We've gone from on a path to 4 degrees to 2.4 degrees between Paris and Glasgow. That's really important, millions of lives saved, but it's still nowhere near where it needs to be, 1.5 degrees. And I think that there's some useful things came out of COP26, particularly the decision to come back next year to ratchet up further. That's probably the most important thing, the methane announcement, the bilateral between China and the US. But I think movement in the right direction isn't success in relation to climate breakdown. That 1.5 degree is not an arbitrary target, it's a science-based upper limit on the heating that we can risk before ecosystems upon which the whole of human life depends reach irreversible tipping points. So I think you have to come out of COP looking elsewhere, particularly for where the leadership that keeps us on track, or gets us on track rather, I should say, to peak and halve emissions globally in the next 10 years is going to come from. And there, I think you can really see why city leadership is so important, because at COP, you did see a genuine step up in science-based climate commitment underpinned by real progress on action. So taking the commitment bit first, 1,000+ cities went to COP26 and committed to genuinely science-based targets, their fair share of halving global emissions by 2030, taking effectively the standards that C40 cities like London have adopted for many years now as a condition of membership of C40, and that's now spread from the 100 or so cities in C40 to 1,000+ all around the world. And it matters in a number of ways. It matters just in the absolute terms of what those commitments mean. It's about 1.4 gigatons reduction per year by 2030 of global emissions. That's the equivalent of taking out the entire emissions of Japan or even India from the global climate emissions. But I think equally it's important because in the context where there's so much, I thought, good, sober reflection on progress but not success at COP26, you do need to see what leadership really looks like, what to provide hope, to provide clarity that what science demands can actually be done. And I think that for that reason it was very important, and not just the kind of high level stuff, but also we saw real shifts in from going to 30 to about 500 cities now committed to bringing in zero emission building codes, similar things around energy, food, etc. But perhaps more important than, as always, than the commitments to action in the future is just seeing what's happening on the ground in cities at the moment. I know Shirley is, I'm sure, going to talk about you, Les, and quite rightly so, because it is an absolutely world-leading programme in London, the toughest vehicle emission standards anywhere, any city in the world, massively expanded zone, and in a context where many mayors would have taken the opportunity of a pandemic to delay or hold back, but Mayor Khan rightly judged he had to proceed for the benefit of Londoners' health, but also I think because you could see that public opinion is supporting those kind of measures. The same way in Paris that Mayor Hidalgo has taken the public with her, got re-elected, and a really aggressive policy taking out highways from the city, massive expansion of cycling lanes. Or on the other side of the world, we heard a lot at COP from Mayor Lopez of Bogota, who's got a really massive program with expanding mass transit, cycling, walking, increasing public space within the city, which he's able to finance through new charges on car use in the city, and making the fleet of electric buses, they're now one of the biggest outside of China, despite the relatively small size of Bogota's economy. Or, other part of the world, Seoul, South Korea, where the city is committed to retrofit all of the public buildings in the city, not this decade, but by the end of next year, with a huge job creation program against it. Or Shwani in South Africa, the first city in Africa setting now a zero emission building code. I could keep going on, but you can really see the action. I think the other part of your question, the role then of organisations like C40 in Italy and others is, I don't think that gulf between leadership and particularly immediacy of action against science-based targets between city level government and national government. It's not an accident. So there are certainly reasons in terms of the constituency of population, particularly in big cities, but another big factor is because those big city leaders in particular are just so networked now. They're constantly collaborating with each other. Good ideas spread fast. They're constantly comparing themselves with other cities. So you're getting that race to the top. All the things I just talked about, all the mayors across C40 are aware of those and are re-evaluating their policies against what they now see as the leaders in each sector. The mayors in C40 even chose to go up to COP together on a train from London to Glasgow because they didn't want to waste any time where they could be talking to each other and learning from each other. And then in organisations like C40, that commitment to science-based climate action is codified in leadership standards, and you lose your membership if you don't meet up to them. So we've had the mayor in Auckland recently going back to his council to revise their climate plan because it wasn't enough to meet C40 standards. Or Mumbai lost its membership of C40 because it didn't meet those standards, but has recently come back in with a really massively expanded programme. So I think for all of those reasons, that's why quite rightly cities are being, and political leadership in cities is being seen as at the forefront of leadership on climate action. I guess I finish though just in thinking of the kind of challenge ahead, because if you're genuinely committed to science-based inclusive climate action, then there are endless tough challenges ahead. So when I look at the data across the whole of C40, there's things that we measure, the kind of high impact actions that really make the difference. Generically, universally across C40, we need to see those delivered at 3 times the scale next year as they were last year. Or at an individual level, in Los Angeles, one of the largest electric bus fleets in the United States, but to get to their targets for 2030, they need a 5-fold increase in electric bus procurement next year. And if you're committed equally to doing that in an equitable way, then you've got to have really tough and difficult conversations around just transition at the same time as we are, for example, with our South African mayors as they try and close down coal power stations. So I think city's big role setting the agenda on what science-based climate action looks like, putting more positive pressure for when nation states come back next year, but most importantly, just showing what can and needs to be done right now so it drives and changes global markets.
Thank you, Mark. So to follow up on this, I think it reminded me that at the end of COP26, President Alok Sharma took to the stage and said that in order to achieve 1.5 degrees, or I think to use the NFCCC language, to keep 1.5 degrees alive, we have managed through the text of the Glasgow Pact to do that. But its pulse is weak, and it will only survive if we maintain our promises and keep to our commitment. So what can cities do, and what do they need to align, both in terms of national governments or perhaps downscale, in order to deliver on these targets that they set out? What needs to be alignment, perhaps in terms of finance, and in order to achieve some of those climate targets?
Well, obviously, I think the first thing is to have the right target and the kind of really serious assessment of what you need to do to deliver that target, and that's what C40 cities absolutely have as condition of kind of membership, and we provide some support to enable that. But I feel the kind of next big step that we're going to have to see at all levels of government everywhere is the real serious annual climate budgeting. So aligning the financial budget with the carbon budget each year, so that you can only set the financial budget if you can demonstrate that it's going to lead to meeting the targets on an annual basis. Because we've got to bring this right down to what's being delivered next week, next month, over the next year, the normal cycle of government, if those 10-year, 20-year targets are going to be hit. And as I say, because it's difficult, there's a number of cities now really doing that. Oslo has been operating a climate budget for a number of years. There's 11 of the cities in C40 now started collaborating together to work out their version of doing that. And there's lots of different ways that you can go about it. But ultimately, it means that real kind of whole government approach, that every department has got to have its targets and as part of the overall city target. And every policy, every expenditure, every use of soft power has got to be evaluated against how it keeps those targets on track. I do think a positive thing out COP was the real emphasis that was placed on the non-state actor role, the race to zeros, the role of the champions. Nigel Topping, Gonzalo did it, did a really fantastic job in kind of elevating that role. So it gives us a platform, but now it comes back to the kind of the government level, and the same will be true in businesses, to really codify how you're going to deliver against these incredibly difficult targets.
Great. So I take it from your previous remarks that you think cities are absolutely central to this, and we cannot do without cities. We cannot achieve our climate targets without cities, which is a position many of us, I'm sure, share. But do you think this opening up of the UNFCCC, the COP processes, the global climate discussions to cities has led actually to the expected results? That started back in COP22 with the Marrakesh partnership. Did it achieve its full potential, or is the process still slow? Is it a governance issue? Is it the fact that they're not parties? Could you comment on this at all? What would your assessment be?
I think that everything that's emanated from the Marrakesh partnership, which now kind of expresses itself in the Champions program, the race to zero, so the non-state actors coming to COP with really clear science-based contributions to halving emissions by 2030 and zero mid-century targets. That's absolutely progress. It's helped to galvanise the non-state actor sector further. It undoubtedly has provided lots of positive pressure into the negotiations between the governments, and a lot of the things that I said at the start that I thought were successes out of COP, I ascribe particularly to the role of the climate movement in creating that pressure, particularly the activist movement, the youth movement, and others who've really put that pressure on, and then the role that the cities have done in kind of showing what can be done political leadership, but it hasn't gone far enough yet. And you hear this from the leading officials in the UN in private, that it's a crazy situation where you've got the political leaders who are most committed to climate action, most demonstrating that action using their powers and their budgets. So city leaders in the main, some state leaders as well, but who are not in the part of the formal processes where the world is trying to come together to collaborate to overcome this extraordinary climate crisis. And so constantly still being, a bigger voice on the outside, I think is an impediment. I just go back to where I started. We're not going to solve climate breakdown through intergovernmental negotiation. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen fast enough. And so one has to, it doesn't mean that's not important and ignore it. It's absolutely vital, but one has to raise the profile of other poles of leadership. And certainly cities is a very important one. There are certainly others, but cities is a very important one. And I think the more that they're brought into the tent of the annual governmental focus on climate, and that COP is less about the negotiation over the words in those treaties between those countries, and more about the aggregate of government action, and then bringing in the non-governmental action into that as well, the better we will be served. Great,
thanks, Mark. So it's rather ironic that the role of the UNFCCC as an orchestrator, which was meant to be a sideshow, has proved to be perhaps more important than the role of the UNFCCC as the host of the negotiations. So that's it's rather ironic, but perhaps a sign that we're moving in the right direction. So thank you for that, Mark. I think we'd love to turn to Shirley Rodriguez now to discuss her remarks on cities and their role on climate action, perhaps with a focus on London itself. So Shirley, if you could talk to us for a few minutes on what progress do you think has happened during COP26, or any feedback, remarks that you have on Mark's own comments, and also if you could highlight something closer to home here. Sadiq Khan has recently become the chair of C40 itself, and London also has impressive environmental goals. So what would London's aspirations be for the network, and also what role could it be, the network being C40, and what role could it play towards driving action, climate action within the network and also beyond? And finally, if there's enough time, what do you think are the challenges that cities like London are facing when it comes to implementing plans to meet these targets on the ground?
Sure. Thanks, Karim. And hi, everybody. Apologies, I've got a cold, so I may have to go off screen to sneeze at some point, so I don't want to burden you with that. I mean, Mark's talked a little bit about, how COP went, and I think that the thing I'd want to start with really is just to say it isn't the end point. It's absolutely the starting point of all the action that we need to take, and this is something that Sadiq, the Mayor of London, has said, as both as Mayor of London, but now as Chair of C40. He starts his formal tenure today, taking over from the fantastic Mayor Eric Garcetti, who's done so much for the C40 and for the climate action through that network over the last few years in an incredibly difficult situation, having to work virtually, because of the pandemic. So tribute to him. But what Sadiq is clear on is that those commitments that were made at COP, whether through the network C40 or whether, when lots of people came to COP making commitments, whether at national level or non-state actor level, they can't just stay there. They have to be turned into tangible actions. And the science, all the reports are pointing to, how late we are in taking action. So we have to take action now and not in 10, 20 or 30 years time. So really his role, both as a London mayor and now a C40 chair, is really to press home that the fact that we need that action. Cities being at the forefront of the impacts of climate change, but they're also, as you know, huge centres of population, consumers, producers, emitters of emissions. So how, but are able to act, have lots of different ways to act. And I think one of the areas that, that C40 can help with is providing that sort of best practice sharing that allows cities with different powers and different funding levels to take action on the areas they can do, and then collaborate on areas where they don't necessarily have direct powers, but they do have a desire to act. In terms of what Sadiq's priorities are for C40, he was very clear at COP. Firstly, it's about how do we address the twin dangers of air pollution and climate change, partly because many of the solutions to tackle air quality are ones that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also because these are the way to really build the case for action is to really demonstrate how this is going to help deliver outcomes for citizens. So particularly for Londoners, how do we improve the health outcomes? We have a very big problem of toxic air pollution in London. So how can we do that in tackling climate change as well? And one of the areas that we've been focusing on, that Sadiq has made a key part of his administration, has been work on air pollution, and in fact, Mark mentioned it, the ultra low emission zone, which we've just recently expanded a few weeks ago to 18 times its original size, that sort of small central London area. So it's a big area, but we've already seen huge impacts from the first zone, a sort of almost halving of pollution emissions in central London. We expect to see now that it's extended that we'll see 30% reduction in air pollution emissions, but also road vehicles reduction as well, which will all not have a knock-on impact on carbon as well as air pollution. And one of the things that helped us make that case was rolling out a network of monitors, air pollution monitors, to really sort of bring home to people what air pollution means, give them the means to campaign and lobby the mayor and others for action. And so there's a commitment that Sadiq has made to roll that programme Breathe London out to other cities across the world as a part of a Breathe Global initiative. I think the other thing that he's very vocal about is, as we recover from the pandemic, we absolutely have to address the inequalities that were further highlighted by the impacts of COVID-19 that were exacerbated, in fact, by the pandemic. So inequalities in access to open space, inequalities in jobs and the impacts, the economic impacts and so on. And similarly, we've seen that sort of impact falls unequally, certainly on climate, on global south cities. So one of the things that we've been talking about with Mark and colleagues there at C40 is how can we commit more funding of the C40 budget to support global south cities, the ones that could contribute to the least to climate change, but are the ones that are most severely affected by its impacts. So partly a budget issue, but also an approach issue. So moving on from the work that C40 have been doing on a global Green New Deal, how do we expand that program and project to really ensure that just transition? So, you know, how do we embed social justice into our recovery? How do we promote the new good green jobs that all our citizens around the world will need? And then, you know, back to that sort of doers, not delayers rhetoric that Sadiq has talked about, you know, allowing cities to get on with it. You know, many cities, Mark's talked a lot about the examples there, are leading by example. We have, you know, a commitment by more than 1,000 cities showing the passion and desire to act. But governments, if they can't help, need to get out of the way and let, you know, cities get on with it. And it's absolutely clear the governments cannot deliver on their NDCs or even tougher commitments and targets without involving their citizens, and the big centres of population are cities, and these are where mayors and many stakeholders are willing and wanting to act. And in terms of COP26 itself, you know, it's mixed, isn't it? So we had a Cities and Built Environment Day, which was, you know, a great plus, you know, really gives focus to and a sort of showcasing of what cities were able to do. Lots of great announcements, like the Race to Zero example, for example, and lots of commitments by cities to take action and financing and so on. But the overarching narrative of COP, you know, whilst the 1.5 was kept alive, as you said, Karim, you know, and Mark said, you know, we are still on course for a 2.4 degrees world. So you know, there's some promising things around deforestation and methane and finance, you know, greater recognition of adaptation and so on, but really not enough about how to support those who are going to take the action and can deliver that action. So again, you know, I'd argue that cities really needed to have greater recognition, and we didn't get that. So looking forward to COP27, I think that's where, you know, we will have a greater role, and we will need to, because certainly some of the nations are already saying we're not going to revise our NDC. So how do we show that those commitments at COP26 have become tangible, and what more can be done? And in terms of the sort of opportunities and challenges that we're facing in London, you know, we want to lead by example. I've talked about the ULEZ, you know, we're doing a lot of work on retrofitting, for example. I wish we could retrofit all our buildings like Seoul is doing, because we have different powers and different abilities and different sort of areas of finance. But where we can take action, you know, we're moving ahead, as I've talked about. You know, we've secured funding to retrofit our homes and public buildings, but not at the scale that we need. We are pushing ahead with electrification of our buses. You know, the mayor has said that he can electrify the 9,000 strong bus fleet by 2030 if we're given additional government support. We can do it by 2034 if our current funding settlement is allowed to be funded. We have a little dispute with government at the moment about, you know, what the funding settlement for London's transport should be. On our new development, we have the best in class sort of net zero carbon standards, achieving 50% greater carbon emission savings than the government standards. I mentioned the ULEZ, lots of greening work, you know, partly because of, you know, resilience, but also to enable people to get out and also tackle the ecological emergency. So whenever Sadiq talks about the climate emergency, we also mean the nature emergency. How do we make sure that we're protecting our biodiversity and restoring it where we can? The big challenge, of course, is, as ever, and all cities will say this, we don't have the powers or the funding we need to meet our own targets, let alone contribute to government's targets. In London, we've estimated at the last count we'd need in the order of 61 billion, and probably a lot more, to really make sure that we can meet our 1.5 degree aspirations. We don't have that funding level from public sector or the private sector, so we're working on a financing facility to help try and mobilise that finance and create the pipeline of projects that we need. Working on, for example, divestment as well, so that we can reorient our pension funds into more green investment as well. And on powers, we have levers over about 50% of the emissions in London. We've been arguing with government for a long time that, you know, to devolve more powers to enable us to take action, for example, on retrofitting our buildings. We'd love to have the power, say, that New York has on the ability to direct energy efficiency improvements. But where we can act, like on transport or planning, we are. So I guess just to end really, you know, COP really showed what needs to be done, really highlighted that, you know, but as Mark's pointed out, you know, we are way off where we need to be. lots of cities are taking lots of leadership initiatives, and through the C40, we're sharing that best practice and trying to accelerate and concert, that sort of that concerted action, that collaborative action. So we're really trying to play our part, but we need governments, not just our own, but governments around the world to really unlock that potential and allow us to act. And we are, a race against time. So I think that's the pressing issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for highlighting how London is leading by doing and leading by example. I think it's great to hear all those details. So a couple of things that I want to follow up on from your point. You mentioned limitations very briefly and how cities some have different powers. So I personally am a big fan of climate action in cities and advocate for that strongly. And I think that cities are the perfect scale for climate action, and that they can collaborate with different scales, with national scales and also with businesses, so upscale and downscale. But they certainly have those limitations. But I would love to hear from you. What do you consider to be the most significant limitation to progress on climate action in cities, or implementing climate action in cities? And I will have another question also on just transition, but I'll ask that afterwards.
Well, I talked about powers, but I guess, I talked about, so for example, we don't have enough of the powers to take direct action, but I think, where we don't have the powers, we try and work around them. And I think what that means is that you don't get the speed of action, because you have to work, with lots of partners and so on. But one of the things that came out of the pandemic was a much more collaborative approach between the various stakeholders that operate in London. So we set up a London Recovery Board, which the mayor chairs alongside the mayor, the leader of London councils, which is the 33 London local authorities in London, because powers are distributed in this very crazy way among lots of different institutions. But on that board, we have the business sector represented, universities, the NHS, and so on. And for the first time, those organisations have come together, prompted by the need to build back better from the pandemic, and agreed a number of missions around how do we provide a safety net for those most affected by the pandemic, how do we restore our high streets that have been really badly affected, and a Green New Deal mission, which is the one mission that I'm leading on. And that agreed an objective that everybody signed up to, where we're going to try and double the size of London's green economy by 2030, precisely through action on tackling the climate and ecological emergency and our toxic air. These are, that's unheard of. That's the sort of thing that would have taken many years and probably would never have got to. But within a matter of months, all those organisations have agreed to it, and now we're working on it. Even where we don't have the powers, for example, on retrofit, we're now working together. There's going to be a summit in the spring where we're coming together to make to talk about the action we're taking to accelerate the work we need to retrofit London's buildings, both our homes and our workplaces. Because without tackling the hundreds of thousands of homes that need to be retrofitted a year, and the thousands, tens of thousands of workplaces, there is no way we're going to meet our 1.5 degree action plan target within 2030. So I would say powers, but we're trying to work around that. And similarly on funding, absolutely, we have a huge issue at the moment with, I talked about Transport for London and the funding settlement. We don't have the same level of government support that, say, New York or Paris does. Most of the funding for transport in London comes from fare income. So 72%, as opposed to something like half of that for New York or Paris, and 20% for Singapore. So that's a massive call on fare pairs to support the initiatives and infrastructure that we need in London, that will then drive down those carbon emissions, like bus electrification and so on. So in the absence of, whilst that argument carries on, but in the absence of funding, we have to mobilise more private finance, and that financing facility, I think, is the big barrier. We've been talking for years, over successive COPs, I think, about how do we mobilise more private finance, and we have that same conversation. It is moving slow, it is moving slowly, but not at the pace, and I think that's probably the biggest barrier, I think, is trying to move that finance into practical action, getting that confidence of investors to make those investments, and trust cities to get on with it. So I guess that's the biggest barrier I'm certainly facing in London, because we can certainly work around the other stuff.
Great, thank you. And you also mentioned briefly just transition. So I wanted to ask you if there are examples, perhaps in 2 minutes, of
Yeah.
the role of local collaborations within London in driving a just urban transition, if you like.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical because we know we have huge changes in our economy and we have to move, make them happen fast. But you need to bring people along. People don't know what a green job is. What does this mean? Am I going to have a job? Are my kids going to have jobs? What does it actually mean? Do I have the skills? And around that, there's a whole ecosystem of academic institutions, businesses, and others who are also trying to grapple with what are the things that we need to do. On retrofitting, for example, we know we need to install more heat pumps, but we don't have the heat pumps technology, we don't have the skills, the supply chain to even move at the pace that we need to do. So it's a really complex web of things that we're trying to work on. But one example on just transition is something that the pandemic provoked, which was basically, the complete crashing of the aviation support sector. So in West London, supporting Heathrow, we have a whole network of businesses and organisations, from caterers to transport organisations and so on. And that cut in aviation has had a massive impact on a huge swathe of West London, and huge sectors of jobs, which were already disproportionately employing people from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic groupings, or and had lower than average pay. So in looking to how do we support that sector, what are the new jobs that we should try and help people get into, that's what we've got to try and address, is those inequalities, as well as giving people the idea of what new jobs there are. There will still be an aviation sector there. Heathrow isn't going away, but do we want fewer flights? The mayor has been very clear about opposition to a third runway, and so on. So what are the alternatives? And we're working very closely with the local authorities in that area and the businesses in that area. We're doing some research on what the impacts and so on, so that we can start to work with organisations across London to resolve that.
Well, thank you. It's always very hard to leave no one behind, I must say. So with that, I would love to turn to a more conversation with both Shirley and Mark, and within this second half of this conversation. And so I'll direct questions at either of you, and feel free to comment on those as well. I will try and take as many of those questions as possible, leaving perhaps the last 10 minutes for questions and answers, because we have quite a few questions that we have received. So I think the first question, perhaps we'll direct that at Mark and give Shirley a breather. John Kerry, the climate envoy, has described 2021 as the critical year in a critical decade, and now 2021 is over, but the challenges don't seem to be any smaller. As a matter of fact, they seem to be bigger. So what do you think will happen to cities in the next couple of years to achieve what needs to happen in the next couple of years in order to achieve these 2030 goals of halving the emissions? We need to ramp up very quickly. Will we see a push towards Race to Zero, or similar to Race to Zero, perhaps an acceleration of Race to Zero, similar to the one we saw in COP26 or ahead of COP26? Now we know about 27 and 28, and we have an idea about their agendas. Do you think we'll see a similar push in the run within the next 2 years for cities as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just in an era now where every year is going to be the most critical. It's just the pressure's just going to keep mounting, and every year that the world fails to deliver on its targets just makes the next year harder. But I think in the city space, I think there's a ton of positive momentum now with that 1,000-odd cities in Cities Race to Zero. I confidently expect that that's going to grow and grow and grow. So you're just going to get this big groundswell at an urban level of real commitment to genuine science-based and inclusive climate action that's going to give much greater confidence into private sector markets about where their investment should be going. You can already completely see the writing on the wall, for example, in the bus sector now, that every major city is planning to shift rapidly to electric vehicles. I think we're seeing that now with a much faster take up in the building sector around the building codes, at the kind of leading edge around clean construction, around looking even at embodied emissions in materials that's going to shift markets. I think the challenge comes in the stuff that Shirley was talking about at the end there, that when you get down to the kind of nitty gritty of some of these targets, particularly the kind of the immediacy of needing to retrofit nearly all the building stock in the older, richer cities of the world, you're coming down to, is the labour market ready? Are there enough people to do the work? Is the technologies available, but is it available in the quantities that's needed to completely change from gas central heating to air source heat pumps, for example? And then those questions of, is the city level of regulation and legislation being supported at the national level? Because where change is happening fastest is where there's really strong science-led, brave city level leadership, and they've got the powers devolved from at the federal level that enable them to do the breakthrough stuff like a ULEZ. But we need that applied across every sector and in every city.
Great. Shirley, in terms of blind spots, I think you spoke about retrofitting as being one of the key sectors that needs to be targeted. Otherwise, we won't hit our decarbonization targets. So, apart from that, apart from the retrofitting component, what other sectors are there that we are missing that need to be addressed and perhaps are not being focused on enough? Would you have any particular thing in mind that you think we're absolutely not giving it due attention?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about buildings, but embodied carbon, food emissions, waste. The consumption emissions agenda is absolutely huge. But I think part of the problem is that people are struggling to deal with direct emissions, let alone thinking about the indirect emissions and how that works. But I think, but this is where Mark's point was right. That there are cities who are leaders who will grapple with that and can act as test beds and pilots and exemplars, whilst everybody else is focusing on other things. So that when we get them to think about it, we've already forged sort of pathways that may be suitable, so you're not reinventing the wheel. So I think for us, we've estimated what our indirect emissions are, our scope 3 emissions, 3 times our direct emissions. We've just published at COP an analysis of the emissions related to food and where they flow. We know that there's a lot of waste even before it gets to London. We import a lot of our food, but then there's a whole load of sort of emissions associated with food waste within London. So now the work is to understand where can we target to try and reduce those emissions, alongside some of the work that we're doing on direct emissions from in the other sectors, transport and buildings. But the conversation, the sort of early question to Mark, I think that while cities can get on with it, you can't underestimate the power of a national regulation. So while cities can set pioneering policies, and if they're allowed to get on with it, can really help provide that evidence. For example, the ICE phase out, in the UK is sending huge signals now, and it was something I know. I don't know if Mark remembers this, but there was a convening of C40 organised with car manufacturers, Mayor Hidalgo, and so on, to try to get them to move faster on electrification. And there was a little bit of movement, but nothing as much as now that you've got nations saying go for it. That you suddenly got them waking up and thinking about it and taking action. But I think some of that was pioneered precisely because of the work in cities pushing for that and saying this needs to happen. And I think that's the role of city leaders, city networks like C40, is really helping translate the desire of their citizens to go faster into tangible areas that can make a difference, and then lobbying governments and showing it can be done, either through the research that we or C40 does, practical actions that show it can be done, through workarounds, and then how much better and quicker it could be if governments actually set the national direction and provided the funding and so on. Conversely, we have, for example, in London, we've got a problem where, we're trying to electrify our buses. We're saying, look, these jobs, the bus electrification of 9,000 London's buses aren't going to fall to London. Wish they did, but they go to Coventry. It helps the industrial Green New Deal agenda for the rest of the country. It creates jobs and new green jobs and so on. So there are examples of where if government supported cities more, it would benefit the whole country's economy, and even internationally.
Thanks, Shirley. Mark, if I may ask you, the narrative around urban resilience or climate adaptation within the context of cities is mostly dominated by mega cities, larger cities, not necessarily smaller intermediate cities. It's also dominated or framed around the global north rather than the global south. What would it take for us to think about urban resilience in a more inclusive way globally?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really critical point, and one of the least satisfactory things coming out of COP26 actually was, I thought, the real failure to address the biggest issues on the table for global South nations and cities. The failure to put that $100 billion a year even on the table. What is it now? 17 trillion has been spent overcoming the COVID pandemic, quite rightly, but we still can't find in the wealthiest countries 100 billion a year to support nations that have been devastated by climate impacts. And I think more and more it's a little bit the same, looking at the discussion over the last few days around vaccine inequality, and it's a failure even of enlightened self-interest for the wealthier nations of the world to make available the resources and get rid of the patents that block the ability of global South countries to manufacture the vaccines that they need. Comes back to haunt everybody as then the virus continues to spread and mutate in the places that aren't vaccinated. And I think the failure to properly finance and address resilience in the most climate threatened countries of the world will come back to hit everybody, because though each time a nation with relatively limited resources is hit by a new climate disaster, it reduces the capacity to be able to more rapidly change their economy to reduce its emissions, and increasingly with larger and larger sized economies in the global South, that becomes more and more important to overall targets. I think we just can't talk about mitigation without talking about resilience anymore. And indeed, when it comes to the practical city level, in any case, it doesn't make any sense to separate those two things. You would be crazy to be looking at ripping up a road to put in a new cycle lane and not thinking around urban drainage at the same point, or tree shading, or the other things that are going to improve the resilience of the city. So I think that's just where it has to go.
Absolutely. I think we should move on to questions and answers, because we have a ton of questions. So if I may ask you to limit your answers to 1 minute each. I'll start with Shirley, and I have a question from David Ness. How will London prevent proposals such as the extravagant Tulip Tower that was only knocked on the head at the last minute? How will it constrain construction of new offices, hotels, and shopping centers, and all the emission generating additional floor area, and achieve massive increase in retrofit, as Mark mentioned Seoul is doing?
So we have a framework in London to govern new development, the London Plan, which has to go through a very complicated evidence gathering process and hearings, and then gets approved by the Secretary of State. So that particular development, Sadiq opposed very clearly, and the developers didn't listen and appealed to the government, who have the final say on those very strategic developments. And luckily, they agreed with Sadiq, and it didn't go ahead. But there are a number of other areas where that doesn't necessarily happen. So planning, unfortunately, is not just down to the mayor, but the framework, and we've been arguing for a long time now that government needs to review its framework, its planning framework, to take into account its net zero commitments. So they haven't yet committed to do that. So that's something we keep pressing.
Great. Mark, again, 1 minute. Question from Martina Juvara. She agrees with you, intergovernmental agreements provide a base, but not the only one. It will not be fast enough. However, in most countries, cities have no fiscal autonomy and immense duties, especially in facing extreme climate events. What can C40 and other partnerships do for those cities that cannot be members, have limited budgets and a few technical skills?
Well, that's what the Cities Race to Zero is about. So the intention there is that it's a sort of framework that any city that wants to make the same kind of science-based commitments as C40 can be part of, but will then benefit from all of the best practice sharing that we make available from C40 to all of those cities the templates, as sort of Shirley talked about, once one or two cities have already cracked a problem in a particular sector, it's much easier for other cities to follow. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And of course, that kind of lobbying of shifting at national governments, increasingly what we'll do is we'll identify issues in a particular country to try and shift government policy that will then benefit all cities, not just the C41 that might be the anchor.
Great, thank you. Another question for Shirley. What is London doing? The question is from Simon Burkett. What is London doing to obtain more powers from the government to decarbonize buildings, which are responsible for approximately 78% of greenhouse gas emissions generated within London?
Constant lobbying of government to make the point that they can't meet their targets without London being able to meet its target or fair share of its target. So we've been lobbying for devolution of powers to set minimum energy standards, to be able to, lobbying, for example, on the VAT, for example, on retrofitting or refurbishments, to downscale or get rid of that, so that people are encouraged to do more. But as I mentioned earlier, whilst we continue to lobby and make the case, we bid to government's funding. We're doing quite well in securing a bit more of our than we have in the past. And then the retrofit summit I talked about in the spring is our attempt to do that sort of workaround, to progress what we can do in the absence of that devolution of powers.
Great. Question to Mark from RT Shah. Could we hear case studies? For example, what has Mumbai planned and what is it doing?
So Mumbai, as I say, just recently rejoined C40. They're now producing their climate change plans are consistent with those C40 standards. Amongst the things they're really focusing on is kind of nature-based solutions, so that the city's development is consistent with the increased threat, particularly of sea level rise. So lots more kind of expansion of the mangroves rather than reduction of them, changing where development takes place so that it's not going to be so vulnerable. A big expansion of their electric bus program and a major expansion of renewable energy supply, largely PV, within the city. But that's before they've completed the plan. So let's wait and see. I know they're very ambitious.
Thanks, Mark. Question for Shirley. You in French. Can you explain more on why the city, I assume London is meant here, doesn't have the power to put an emission tax on buildings as New York City is doing?
Because that's you have to have the powers given to you by government. So, for example, we were able to introduce the emissions charge scheme, like ultra low emissions zone and the congestion charge, because the government were able to made available the powers for the mayor to do that. But on energy efficiency, for example, we rely on the government to make those powers available to us to do that. So there's a lot of work around taxation, for example. The mayor is on a series of commissions on finance and talked about, if more the ability to raise taxes at local level would enable us to do various other things, but also similarly a whole range of sort of other powers that would allow us to do to go further and faster, for example. So it's down to governments agreeing, and that this is a long-standing issue about the sort of the relative powers of the national central government and local authorities, and that's not just unique to London. It's around the world.
Thanks, Shirley. I think we have a question here about the elephant in the room, which is growth, from David Ness to Mark. You mentioned transport initiatives and retrofit in Seoul, etc., and about achieving emissions reductions equal to the whole of Japan. But C40 Clean Construction Declaration envisages a city size of Singapore or New York will be added every month until 2050. Does C40 really accept such massive growth in floor area and associated embodied and operational emissions?
Well, I think let's separate a couple of things. Well-designed, compact cities with very high environmental standards are far more sustainable places for people to live than lots of kind of small towns, villages kind of spread out across the country. And that's often why you've got lower per capita emissions in the best run and best designed cities than the national average. So I don't think kind of urbanization per se is the problem for climate. It's bad urbanization, but I think the kind of other part of that question, growth, is really important. So for the wealthier global north nations, I think it is now abundantly obvious that chasing ever-increasing GDP growth is a recipe for disaster. It's a big reason why we have failed to take proper account of the climate crisis more early, and needs to be, we at the very least, we should be agnostic about GDP growth, but should be focusing on improving quality of life within environmental constraints, ecosystem constraints, so that we can protect the future of life for everybody.
And the last question in 30 seconds, Shirley, a question from Austin Short, are there any plans to expand district heating in London?
Yeah, we have what we call a local energy accelerator, which is rolling a number of schemes out. Again, we know we need to do much more and much faster. We're not like European cities to that, but the planning framework requires that, and it's more about it's a combination of new, but also how do we retrofit existing those heating systems to existing buildings as well. So yeah, have a look on our website. There's lots of information on there.
Great, thanks. Mark, any closing remarks? 1 minute for you and 1 minute for Shirley for closing remarks before we end this panel.
Well, it's been a great discussion, and I'll just end because I noticed Simon Burkett is on because he's been putting questions in. I think just to note here, we haven't talked so much about the activist level here, but the role that Simon and others played in London and really pushing air pollution right up the agenda has made a massive difference to have political leaders like Sadiq Khan being able to take such decisive action on the issue. And I think that nexus between really strong climate activism, the role that everybody can play in pushing up issues of climate and equity is what's needed to then make it easier, more possible for strong, brave political leaders at the city and national level to take the action that all of the evidence and science shows them that they should.
Thanks. Shirley?
Yeah, I'd echo that. Without people like Simon or Mums for Lungs or Choked Up or the school strikes or whatever, getting that on the agenda, and maybe sometimes we don't go as far as people would want, but it really does help provide the sort of case for action. And you'll have seen in numerous polls how much environment and climate has risen up the agenda, often so much so that it's hard to see why governments aren't recognizing that this is a desire, and because people recognize this is about their well-being, themselves, their families, and future generations as well. So really important that this is a collaborative effort. It is cities, mayors, activists, the other non-states and governments. We really can't do this without working with each other.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for those final remarks. And on that note, I would like to thank you both for sharing your insights, and I'd like to thank all those who participated, all those sent questions forward. And if you think we should have more events on the role of cities, please get in touch. Also, if you enjoyed this event and would like to hear more from the Environment and Society program at Chatham House or the Sustainability Accelerator, please reach out to us. You can sign up to our newsletter for news and events, and you can also follow us on Twitter. There should be some information within the chat, hopefully, on how to do those things. And once again, thanks to both Mark Watts and Shirley Rodriguez for their contribution and for the great insights. And we hope to have them on one of those events once more. Thank you so much.